So we're going to the first part, then we'll have a little break and we'll do the second part. This first part is going to be a bit shorter, and the last part is a bit longer, but it's definitely much more interesting, in my point of view. So we're going to look at how Rome adopted this Babylonian paganism. So, as I said, I'm going to have a look at the argument that Mystery Babylon, Revelation 17, refers to the Catholic Church. And to do this, I'm going to go into the history of Babylonian paganism. Then I'm going to explain how the church in Rome has adopted these practices through church history. And then I'm going to walk through Revelation 17, only verses 1 through 7, to pinpoint what we understand Mystery Babylon and the link to the Catholic Church that we see, and the reasons that I believe that that is Mystery Babylon, therefore hopefully proving that there is a Babylonian paganistic root in the Catholic Church still present today. So we need to understand this concept of two Babylons. So Hislop makes this distinction in his book, The Two Babylons, between this idea of what the old and new Babylon is. And we see both of these in the Bible. Obviously, we've seen the old Babylon, particularly if you look at Daniel, which is the Neo-Babylonian Empire. We see prophecies of these being destroyed in Isaiah and Jeremiah. However, despite the old Babylonian religion being destroyed, the mystery religion that we see has continued through successive empires that have conquered Babylon. We've also seen a big mixing in the Middle East between lots of religions, lots of different ideas being taken. So this has really come to a head with the Roman Empire that took on a lot of these traditions, which is then, I suppose, merged into the Catholic Church, what we see today. And it's really important that we understand that, obviously, we're going to look into this, but the origins of Babylon, we're going to see that this is the source of all idolatry and opposition to God, and that is today manifest in the Catholic Church. So we'll have a look at the origins of Babylon. We'll have a look at the origins of Babylon. So we see the origins of Babylon when we look at the construction of the Tower of Babel, particularly in the early part of Genesis 11. Now, this is led by a man named Nimrod. Nimrod becomes a really important figure that I'll be getting into. But you see Nimrod being talked about in Genesis 10, verse 8 and 9. And the key ideas that we can take from these verses, not a lot is spoken of Nimrod, but there is a lot in Babylonian mythology about Nimrod. His name means he rebelled. Firstly, so that should give you some indication of what he's about. And then it's understood here in verse 9, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. It says there, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And here the word for before is often used to mean against. Many people would argue it's almost a mistranslation. It shouldn't mean before, it should mean against. It's an argument made by theologians. So we see in Nimrod almost the first active major opposition to God's order, to God as such. Obviously, people have sinned before, but in Nimrod, with the construction of the Tower of Babel, many people make the argument it's almost like the first religion, because obviously the Tower of Babel was an attempt to reach God, and that is effectively what religion is. It's man's attempt to almost reach God as such with their standard. So like I say, it's understood that Nimrod went on to become the first king of the city of Babylon. There are many different understandings, but if you read The Two Babylons, Alexander Hislop gets into this idea that it's Cush that actually founded Babylon, and Nimrod that went on to become the first king. And in Babylonian mythology, Nimrod is then proclaimed as a god, or this godlike figure who they worship through the ages. And he forms part of this Babylonian trinity. This includes Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz. You may recognize the name Tammuz, particularly from, I believe, Ezekiel he's mentioned. I think in some of either Kings or Samuel he's mentioned. Semiramis was Nimrod's wife, and Tammuz was his son. And there's a really key story that surrounds the death of Nimrod, particularly. Hopefully in a minute you'll start to see the relevance to today. So when Nimrod died, Semiramis claims that Nimrod was resurrected as the sun god, and then he went on to inseminate her, and that's how then she gave birth to Tammuz. She then obviously claimed that Tammuz was a therefore reincarnated version of Nimrod, and was therefore divine. Obviously, this is where we get the idea of Tammuz being the sun god, and subsequent gods which are replaced by Tammuz end up being the sun god. This is a very important concept of understanding. And then, from this, Semiramis claimed that she saw an evergreen tree grow from the dead stump, which symbolizes Nimrod's new life. To celebrate this, gifts would be left under a tree in and around the time of the winter solstice, and this would have been around the time of the 25th of December, which is dedicated to Tammuz, which they do these things. This probably sounds quite familiar in terms of what things that Christians will be doing. This then started the Babylonian religion of worshipping Tammuz, the sun. Semiramis was also worshipped, and this is what started a popular religious concept we see, and we will see throughout the Middle East, of mother and child worship. So we have a picture here of Semiramis with Tammuz. Again, if you look at particular Catholic imagery, I've worked in a Catholic school myself, you see this image or something very, very similar to this almost everywhere, okay? It's really important we have an understanding of where that concept has come from. Now, this religious system was then spread around the world, and we see the mother and child worship in many pagan religions. So it's not just the simple fact that it just came from Babylon and it's just a sort of a one-off from there, but rather it has found itself in almost or most of these pagan religions. I would say most likely due to the inspiration of Satan working in these pagan religions, because that's a key concept. You can see here, you've got Asia, you've got Egypt, Greece. Like I say, in Alexander Hislop's book, The Two Babylons, he goes into very much all the detail where these all originate. So again, if you want more details of this, I'd very much encourage reading his book. We're going to have Japan. And the last couple being very significant, in Rome you had Venus and Cupid, which eventually became, what we understand, obviously Mary and Jesus. So this mother and child worship continued all the way through and got brought into Christianity. So obviously with the Roman Empire, this is where obviously the last two come into. But with the Roman Empire, being one of the biggest empires at the time, they took on many traditions and gods of the region that the Roman Empire ruled over, and they brought them into Roman paganism. And then when the Roman Empire became Christianized at the start of the 4th century of Emperor Constantine, he then kept many of those pagan ideas that we see in pagan Rome and brought them into Christianity. I'm going to talk a lot about his conversion, but just to give you, I suppose, an idea beforehand, so we're going to see how his conversion was almost entirely politically motivated and served the purposes that he wanted. It wasn't a true conversion. Many Catholics or people of that persuasion are going to say that Constantine's conversion was good for the world. I'd argue the total opposite. So, once the Roman Empire then adopted Christianity, it is eventually merged into the Roman Catholic Church. And this is the religion which is spread around the world. It's the biggest religion globally at the moment, and it is only growing. And this is the mystery religion that we see in Revelation 17 as Mystery Babylon. And as we walk through Revelation 17, I'm going to make that case. So, before I dive into Revelation 17, we've got to understand the context of Revelation. If anyone obviously doesn't know, in chapter 1, we see the things that John saw, the visions he saw. We see chapter 2 and chapter 3, the things that are, which are the 7 churches. However, there is a prophetic element to that, which I'm going to get into. We then see chapters 4 to 22, which are the things that will take place after this. We see between chapters 6 and 18, we see a description of what's going to happen in the Great Tribulations. We've got the with the 7 bowls, etc. And chapter 17 describes the woman then riding the beast. And this is the description of the religious and political world system that's going to be active in the tribulation. And we're going to see the links to Rome with that. So, it's only 7 verses we'll walk through, but hopefully we'll be able to identify the key points that link this to Rome. So, reading from Revelation 17:1. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked to me with me, saying to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup, full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication." You'll see the important bit. "And on her head a name was written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. But the angel said to me, 'Why did you marvel? I tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and then the 10 horns.'" Then John goes on to explain much of, obviously, the behaviour that both the woman riding the beast, what they do, and then chapter 18 gets into their destruction. However, we're going to walk through this, and we're going to see, hopefully, how the distinction between the old Babylon and new Babylon, and how this new Babylon is Rome. So the first thing to note, obviously, this woman obviously is a great harlot, and harlotry is often represented, or often represents apostasy. We see with Jeremiah, Hosea. Remember, many times Israel are told they're playing the part of the harlots. They are playing the harlots. In Hosea, he's instructed to marry like a prostitute. So that idea is almost, so it's not just idolatry as such, but more very much apostasy, which then we've got quite a good candidate for an apostate church, or so-called church. We see fornication, so the harlot is making the kings of the earth commit fornication. Again, fornication, whenever it talks about Israel committing fornication, it's often when they're led astray into these false religions, which are heavily linked to this mystery religion of Babylon throughout the Old Testament. And then so we can see the link between, obviously, Babylon and idolatry. And it says, so the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. It's going to be the case that this is the whole world is going to be involved. It's been believed by many theologians that during the time of tribulation there will be one global religion. Whether it's Catholicism in its current form or something later, we'll have to see, but I think the roots are going to be in Roman Catholicism. And we're not too far away from the end times, in my opinion. And we can already see the Catholic Church, as of 2025, it's believed, has gone past the barrier of 1.4 billion people on the planet. So it's by far the biggest religion. And this number's rising as well. There's much talk about a Christian revival going on right now. There are only really 2 churches that are growing, and that's hyper-charismatic and Catholic, or branches of Catholicism. So when people are talking about things like Bibles being bought and things like that, I don't really hold too much hope, because it's those 2 churches that are growing, and true believers are going to get, sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but there's going to be less and less of us as we approach the end times. So we carried on, again, so this is where John sees a woman, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. So a woman can represent many things in the Bible. Typically we see idolatry, so Revelation 2:20, which actually relates to the church of Thyatira, which I believe represents the Catholic Church, talks about Jezebel. In Matthew 13:33, Again, that's a woman with the leaven who hides the leaven. Again, another representative of something that happens in the church involving a woman, which is a form of idolatry. But I've talked about Matthew 13 a few times. There's not quite enough time to dive into today. Can represent Israel. We've seen Revelation 12. And then it can also represent the church. So again, we're talked as being the bride of Christ, for example. And obviously I'd make the case, and many theologians make the case, that this woman is going to represent an idolatrous or apostate church. It's going to combine, it's obviously not going to be Israel, but rather it's most likely a church in some way that is involved in idolatry. Again, this would make the Catholic Church quite a good candidate for this. We then see this idea in verse 3 of it has 7 heads. We get an interpretation from verse 9, a couple of verses on, or a few verses on, that the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Again, I'm unsure of this, but just so you're made aware, many commentators suggest that this references or refers to the 7 hills or mountains of Rome, since the word for mountains can often mean hill. So Rome was obviously formed by 7 hills, and this idea that many people might interpret this to be like a pope figure who obviously sits in Rome on those 7 hills, for example. I'm unsure about that interpretation, but it's there if you want to consider it. And then, like I say, obviously having 7 heads and 10 horns. And we see this imagery in Daniel 7. We'll go through this section before we get into Daniel 7. It's really important to note, because this reference to the 10 horns becomes our link then between what is happening here in the tribulation and then the image in Daniel 7 and Daniel 2, linking them all to the end times. It's 10 horns. So it becomes quite important. So as we continue in verse 4, so the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet. Again, this is another potential link to Rome. Historically, Roman emperors wore purple. That was their national representation of their colour as such. And the purple and scarlet is really fascinating because these are actually liturgical colours of the Catholic Church. You'll often see bishops being dressed in purple, and it's cardinals who are just under the Pope. They tend to wear scarlet. So we see, hopefully, we can start to see a clear link between Rome, or the language used about Rome, and the language used about the Catholic Church, and where they come together. And obviously, this woman is adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. So this just signifies wealth. And the Catholic Church is estimated to have a wealth value between 10 billion and 15 billion total. So I'm not sure, I'm not an economist, but that's quite a lot. That's quite a lot. And I imagine that will just keep growing as well. Then we have the key here, so Mystery Babylon the Great. So this term, obviously, Mystery Babylon. If I'm right about what has been said before, about the links to Catholicism, here it's almost revealing that mystery that is the fact that the Catholic Church is rooted in Babylonian paganism. Then we see from verse 6, so I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. This wouldn't be the first time the Catholic Church has historically persecuted other denominations. So this is obviously alluding to the fact that Catholic Church will persecute the saints during the tribulation. But again, we've seen it before, obviously medieval Inquisitions, Spanish and Roman Inquisitions. And then, with the Reformation and Counter-Reformation in this country, we've seen, even for daring to make copies of the Bible, these people have been persecuted, killed, etc. Okay? So the Catholic Church, this isn't a new thing for them to do. And then we get into verse 7, which I find one of the more interesting parts of this. So, obviously, I will tell you the mystery of the woman. And obviously, mystery, there are several mysteries we see throughout the Bible. And one of them is the mystery of the woman or the mystery of Babylon exactly. And this pertains to obviously a hidden truth which is then revealed. And I think a really important mystery part of this is the fact that today many people will look at the Catholic Church as simply a misguided church where there are people that are saved. But we really need to understand that actually not only is the Catholic Church apostate, but it is the face of false religion in the world today, which is something that's not really said. But when you have that understanding of that, then a lot of their behaviours, a lot of their idolatry makes a lot more sense, as opposed to them just being misguided. And then we see here, obviously, we had the 7 heads and then the 10 horns. And we see this in Daniel 7. So this is where we're going to go to next. So obviously I want to prove the link between Mystery Babylon to Rome. I'm going to go through Daniel 7, Daniel 2. And what we're going to see in Daniel 7 and Daniel 2, we're going to see effectively how this Mystery Babylon as the beast, Daniel 2 particularly gives a really good origin of where exactly this comes from, where it is born out. Because if anyone's compared Daniel 7 and Daniel 2 side by side, you see 4 kingdoms laid out in Daniel 7, in Daniel's vision, but you see 5 kingdoms laid out in Daniel 2, in Nebuchadnezzar's vision, which makes for an interesting understanding of that final kingdom in Daniel 7, because according to Daniel 2, that is split into 2 parts. And that final part is going to be in the end times. So it's really interesting. We've got to understand where that root comes from, and I'll get into the interpretations of that. And my belief is that there's definitely, this is the Catholic Church, and there's a very strong evidence to suggest that there are Roman roots in whatever that final beast is, whatever that final empire is. So we've got an image here. So this is really all I'm going to be going through. I'm going to provide scriptures for this image. So in Daniel 2, if you're familiar, hopefully you are, with these passages, quite famously, Daniel 2 has that statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And in Daniel 7, we see the 4 beasts. And they line up quite well because they're talking about the similar things, except for when you get to Rome at the very bottom, how that is split into 2 parts. And we're just going to explore that and work our way through those. So as we look at Daniel 7, so Daniel has had a dream and a vision of 4 beasts, and these represent 4 kingdoms, so we know from verse 17. And Daniel 7:3-7 outlines these. So we're going to see the Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and then, well, it says Rome or Antichrist. He only really describes an Antichrist system at the end, but we're going to see how that relates to Rome when we look at Daniel 2. So, as we see here, so from verse 4, so the first is like a lion and an eagle's wings. We're going to get into why the lion and the eagle's wings means Babylon. We'll explain in a minute. We have the first 5. Another beast was like a bear, so that's the Persian. There's another like a leopard, that's the Greek. And then the 4th beast. This isn't described but as an animal at all. This is just called a beast. And really importantly, we see at the bottom here, and it was different from all the other beasts that were, and it had 10 horns. So again, that relates it back to Revelation 17. So working our way through this, obviously we see the first was like a lion, had eagle's wings. So this is representative of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So if anyone's been to the British Museum, you may have seen these lions with wings. That's an Assyrian image, but that was very, very common at that time. So Babylon was quite close proximity to Assyria, and they used similar imagery. And Nebuchadnezzar particularly, I believe, had winged lions that guarded the gates of the royal palaces in Babylon. That's why that represents Babylon. The second beast, like a bear, is raised up on one side, had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. So this represents the Medo-Persian Empire, Achaemenid Empire. So the reason it's raised up on one side is because the Persians were so much stronger than the Medes. This relates to the fact that, I believe it was Cyrus, who was actually half Mede, half Persian, who managed to combine the two empires. And then the three ribs in its mouth were three empires they destroyed. Obviously, the Persians, we know from Daniel, conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire. It conquered the Median, which is where the Medes come from. So it was a vassal kingdom, but it revolted, and they managed to suppress it. And then the Lydian Empire. So these are the three ribs. It's represented as the ribs between its teeth. We then see the leopard, and on its back had 4 wings of a bird, and the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. So obviously this represents the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. The leopard represents how quickly he conquered much of the known world. His empire spanning, as you think, from Greece, but as far east. Eventually, I believe he reached close to India. And then the 4 heads represent the 4 generals who divided the kingdom after Alexander's death. So Alexander died in his early 30s and divided his kingdom between 4 generals, and they provided 4 Hellenistic empires that came after. So it wasn't exactly the Greek Empire anymore, but simply 4 Hellenistic empires. We then gets interesting because it gets into this final beast, and there's no real indicators that this relates to Rome as such, but we're going to have a look at Daniel 2 to see how it does. And obviously we see the link with 10 horns, and obviously this is a reference in Revelation 17. So you can clearly see how this would be somewhat of an antichrist system, as it's the same reference used in Revelation 17. But then when we examine these empires, when we look at Daniel 2, we're going to see the link with Rome. So Daniel 2, again, that go through 4 kingdoms, Daniel 7 goes through the 4 kingdoms, obviously, but Daniel 2 is going to be slightly different, as Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that contains 5 kingdoms, but the last one is obviously split into 2. And the key difference being in the last one. So again, same again. So when we look at Daniel 2, the head of gold, so this is the statue that we're talking about from Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The head was fine gold, represents the Babylonian. Its chest and arms of silver, which represents the Persian. Its belly and thighs of bronze, which represents the Greek. Its legs of iron, which is the Roman. And then its feet, partly of iron and partly of clay, which becomes really, really interesting, and it's probably the most controversial part of this chapter in Daniel, the revived. So we see this image here. It's also really important to note that many theologians will interpret this to mean the times of the Gentiles. So Luke 21:24 references the time of the Gentiles. I'm going to get into different interpretations about this final empire, but my view is that this empire, or these 5 empires, take us from that time Daniel's talking about until the millennium, which means there can't be any gaps, in my opinion. Which means after the Roman Empire, let's just say this. So many theologians will say that there's a big gap between the Roman Empire and then that Antichrist empire. However, I'm going to argue, I believe that there isn't, which means we've got to think of an empire, or we've got to work out what that revived Roman Empire is, as it's got to be an empire that began, when the Roman Empire finished, and lasts until Christ's millennial kingdom. Okay? There can't be a gap there, in my opinion. So we give a good interpretation here from Daniel. So he says to Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel goes in and interprets his dream. He says, "You are his head of gold." So obviously the first empire is the Babylonian one. After him, see one inferior arose, which was the Persian Empire. And obviously Cyrus the Great invaded Babylon in 539 BCE. So again, we see that in the book of Daniel. We then see another one, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the earth. So that's much of the known world at that time. And this is the Greek Empire. So Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in 330 BCE. We then have the fourth kingdom, shall be as strong as iron. So this fourth kingdom, or fourth empire, is the Roman Empire. And this pretty much took over the place that Greece had. So the Roman Empire, they conquered mainland Greece and Macedon in 146 BC. And the Hellenistic period, so since Alexander's death, obviously, we had the four empires sort of split up. So you didn't, in fact, have a Greek empire, but again, it was more like a Hellenistic influence over the world. This even spread its way to Egypt, for example. But this was officially finished with the War of Actium in 32 BC to 30 BC. So people say that the Hellenistic period ended during the Roman Civil War after Caesar's death. So when Julius Caesar died, there was a big power struggle between those who could potentially take over, and Augustus Octavian, came through as the victor over Mark Antony. You might know like Mark Antony and Cleopatra from Shakespeare. It doesn't quite work out, their love story like that. But eventually, when Cleopatra and Mark Antony eventually commit suicide, that was basically the end of the Civil War, which pretty much marked the end of the Hellenistic period and saw the Roman dominance, particularly with empires, because Octavian was considered to be the first Roman emperor to establish full power, cement his power, and the Roman Empire only grew from there. So then we get into the really controversial part of this passage. So, whereas you saw the feet and toes partly of the potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. So there are many different interpretations of who the feet and the toes represent. There are also many different interpretations as what the iron and the clay represent as well. We obviously know that the iron must be some Roman hangover, and then what's the clay? There are many, many different ideas. I'm not going to get into that today because I think that could take another half an hour, but I just want to talk about what the feet and the toes represent. So the criteria we're looking for to work out what the feet and the toes would be is obviously we're looking for something that's partly made up of the Roman Empire, so we get the iron, and as I said, we're looking for something that is dominant until the millennium. So obviously we're not there yet. So if you think the Western Roman Empire fell in about 476 AD, the eastern half of the Roman Empire continued through the Byzantium until about 1456, I believe, somewhere around then, in which case it got conquered by the Ottomans. So many people argue that the Roman Empire continued in the east. I would have a different point of view. I would say that when the western half of the Roman Empire fell, it merged into the Catholic Church, and there you get the mixing of the iron and the clay and the dominance of the Catholic Church, since the 5th and 6th century has expanded and is, again, now the most dominant religion in the world. There also are many other theories you can get into. The toes, you could say that's 10 toes. That's the 10 regions that broke away from the western half of the Roman Empire when it fell in 476. But again, don't have time to get into that today. But either way, we know that there is some Roman element to the feet and the toes. So whatever view is taken, you can at least see that there is a Catholic connection there, at the very least. There's a Roman element in that final kingdom, a hangover from the Roman Empire, and obviously we're going to see how this all shifted in the 4th century. So why is this significant? So obviously the old Babylon represents the Babylonian Empire, whereas this new Babylon, this mystery Babylon, in my opinion, represents Rome. This should hopefully outline the link between the paganism of Babylon and the current Roman Catholic Church. This becomes really, really important when we're then going to look at the error that's in the church, because there's probably a lot of things that modern-day church does which has its roots in the Catholic Church, which obviously I'm making the case that this has its roots in Babylon, hence the importance there. So we see the progression of idolatry. Again, so it moves from Babylon into pagan Rome, into the Christian Rome, and then the Catholic Church from there. I put this image up here because this is quite important. We see this isn't only a physical map of where things have moved. This is actually where the center of religion, or this mystery religion, has been moved. It starts in Babylon, Pergamus, and Rome. It's really, really important when we look at the next part. I'm going to go through the letter to the church at Pergamus, because it is more than just a physical place in the sense of more than just it represents. Pergamus is not only a physical place that is represented with the religious center that is there, but it also represents the movement of this mystery religion. So it represents a time period in which the church took on this mystery religion, but it also physically. So we're going to see in a minute, when I explain it a bit further, how the priests at Babylon, when that got conquered by Persia, they moved to Pergamus. So there's not only a physical movement, but there's also, I suppose, a spiritual movement when we talk about that time period of Pergamus, which then moved on to Rome, which we'll see representing the letter to the church at Thyatira, which comes after Pergamus. If it sounds complicated, don't worry, we're going to get into it in the next part. So to summarize this part, we can see the progression of idolatry, obviously originating in Babylon and into pagan Rome and into the Catholic Church. As I said, the Catholic Church, this isn't just a misguided church with genuine believers in my opinion, but is the face of idolatry and opposition to God in the world. We're going to see how Pergamus represents a time period during that change. So if you understand about the changes that Constantine made in the 4th century, we're going to see that Pergamus represents this. And then we're going to get into some of the changes that were made. And this has led to the error we see today in the church. So we're going to get into that in the next part.